So when it comes to distortion or straightening, there are three big ones I use. One, on the interior, I'll do the distortion, which is this. Usually that doesn't need to happen, but outdoors. But what I do want to talk about is the vertical, and this is something that comes into play inside and outside a little bit. So if you notice the right and left side of this house, and this doesn't always work, it works probably 80% of the time, is you can straighten the house up. You make it stand up a little bit taller. Sometimes when you do this, not in this angle, but there'll be, if you could see like the rear end of the house, it will tilt it in a weird way, and so you don't want to do that. But in this case, we're able to straighten these two up. We may even be able to go further. Yeah, that's too much, but that's good. It's a slight difference, but as you know, all of these things add up, and it makes the house look a lot more squared up, and it makes the photo look more professional. So doing that with the outside, the exterior shots, is something that I always look at if I have a chance to make this house, a little less tilted out to the bottom. I do. Here's a good case where you wouldn't need to do that, even though this isn't completely vertical. It doesn't make sense when you start looking at doing that. It just starts stretching it, and it looks weird. So, a photo like that we wouldn't touch. We would just want to look to make sure that things looked vertical. Like as far as rotating it, and then make sure it's straight. So, that needed just a slight touch. Probably could have been left alone on this one, but maybe just a tweak. I'm always rotating these photos, trying to get them to where they look really level. Prime example here is rotating this around. When you start rotating, it's almost like taking the exposure, shadows, and darks, and just fussing with them to see if it makes a difference. And again, here I'm zoomed in enough where really all it does is stretch stuff. When we get inside, you'll see it'll really move the doorways, and it's a lot more relevant. So here we're just going to twist this around. I'm looking at this column, make sure everything looks natural. Make it look the way it would if you were walking up to the house. Okay, so here's the interior on a kitchen, and pretty obvious that this is leaning over to the left. And we take this and bring it here. And one of the big tricks with straightening is you can see this windowsill here. So this is at 0, and you can see how it's behaving, as well as this refrigerator. The bottom, excuse me, the bottom of this refrigerator is kicking out, and so is this. Well, who's to say we don't just straighten it like that? Instead of using the vertical. Well, everything needs to make sense visually, so you would bring this around. This looks pretty good. The bottom of this window looks a little kicked out. And so once you do that, a lot of times you have to take your rotation and actually tweak it back a little bit. And that's one thing that I would hope anybody would see, but it's not always obvious, because part of you wants, like, okay, let me get the rotation right, and then let me fix the vertical. And you can see against that line there that that's a better choice, especially with the fridge down here. You're like, that's a good choice right there. Now, one of the other things that will become obvious, this room is pretty straight, is you'll have lines in the middle, which this is really the middle, that are straight, and then you'll just automatically in some rooms have lines that are askew off to the left and right. And when the day is really done, if you remember vanishing point from art class, you know, the one in the middle is the one that really needs to be the straightest, and if these other ones are kind of headed towards a vanishing point, or if it's a different room and you've got them going to a vanishing point, I mean, that's what the eye would naturally see. In this case, I'm going to probably adjust this a touch, only because the countertop looked like it was leaning. But these lines look pretty good. I don't know how obvious. Yeah, you know, you can see it leaning a little bit left, and now we've stood everything up. So we've got this photo. Even though there's a hill here, that house doesn't look straight. And so I would twist this photo around and straighten that house up about like that. You could go a little bit further, but you start to lose some of the photo. But I like that, where it's touching the edge of the frame. The house looks straight now. You know, here's a pretty good example of a photo you might not think to straighten, but you know, if you look at this tree right here and the top of the garage, I think that right there is a whole lot better. You know, that line's not going to be right in the middle of that tree, but you look at that top of that garage was leaning pretty good. And I see these grid lines on this tree right here, stuff like that. Maybe bring it back a touch. But, I mean, that's been rotated. It was almost a whole point. It's not something you have to obsess about or labor over, but again, I just see that. And all my photos, I'm always looking if it needs to be rotated. You know, this photo, I didn't have to rotate this. It was good out of camera. This one, you can start looking at the right side of this house and maybe make an argument to twist that a little bit. Maybe even look at the vertical. But you've got to also, you have to look at all of these lines and see how they're going to be affected. Maybe do one notch on that, but then this next one, you can see this. You know, that helps. And then you've got the edge of that house. You know, that doing that right there isn't going to hurt this house at all. It's only going to straighten it up and make it look nicer. So this is getting in a little bit closer, or we can start talking about rooms. It's a great example of a photo that looks like it would be like, oh, this is fine, but not so much. This right here has got a slight bow in it, which, you know, I mean, I'm on with my wide angle lens right here, so even with interiors, I'm almost always going to adjust that at least 5 or 10. And if I'm looking at this line right here, I can take and then get it nice and straight. I'm also looking obviously here and here and here. So at this point, if I needed to make an adjustment, I could start rotating it if something looked off, but it doesn't. And then, so like, let's take it for instance, if we're looking over here, and if I had to rotate it, that's where you say, okay, that's correct, and then you could get to a point and you could do your vertical to correct that line. We did not need to do that, so I'm going to put this back the way it was. Yeah, and I think, again, looking at this, I think that that looks fine. All these boards look fine. Okay, and we're just going to go through these rooms and basically do the same thing when it comes to straightening. Obviously there's the color correction part, but I'm not touching that. I'm just on straightening here. And with the 10mm lens I use, some people are like, hey, you could, when it imports, you can have it do an automatic lens correction and all that. Well, in my opinion, it doesn't always need that. And if it does the automatic lens correction, it doesn't show up on these sliders, and so now you're trying to adjust against it. And I'd rather bring it in as it was shot and then adjust it accordingly. But when you're doing the distortion, we're always looking at the very outsides. Very rarely is it anything inside, but I mean, in certain rooms it is. And then, just tinker with the vertical and see if it's worth doing. And the vertical is going to usually affect these doorways and these other lines. And then if not, see if, hey, do I need to twist this? And I've been working really hard to get these correct in camera on site, but sometimes you'll think it's dead on a lot of times, and it gets back here and it's just crooked. So this distortion, usually 5 to 10. Sometimes it'll be 15 or 20, 25. Just depends on what the situation is or what you're trying to bring back. But I'll be honest with you, if I'm flicking through here quick, it's usually a 5 and then a vertical and some rotation. Again, looking at this doorway, I could leave this. All this looks good, but this doorway looks bowed. So I mean, I could go to 15 and it starts to mess with this. So, the happy middle on that, maybe 10. And if you get something that's really messing with you and you want one versus the other, again, I don't normally do this. I like to keep the perspective. You could always take that out. And be safe if you had to. So let's take a look at this room. I'm automatically looking here. These doorways, this piece right here, these cabinets. I'm rotating it. Let's see how much it makes sense to do, and then always safe doing that. And in this case, you can see how doing the distortion affects these lines on these cabinets. And then the vertical is going to bring this doorway up and make it upright, which is what we want. We want this to look upright. And then twist this back around. And honestly, this is a perfect example of a photo that is worthy of those sliders. So I did 10. I brought the bow out of this, and now all of this is standing straight up. So I've got 10 on distortion, 10 on vertical, twisted it just a little bit, which is really, affecting how vertical this is over here. And, that's going to look a lot better than that. So this wall right here needs some help. starting out by rotating, it's not going to be the ticket. You know, this is going to be a vertical situation. And so you'll notice that and then this island start coming out. And then we can rotate it as needed. One of those tricky ones. I think that's probably good. You know, we've got this line out here, this line, these lines here. You know, the cabinets look okay. They're not twisted. But this isn't leaning to the left anymore. So, you know, once again, we're +5, +10 with a slight rotation. Is like super common numbers. Again, I don't look at the numbers when I'm adjusting it. I'll click the slider, I'll stare at the photo, and I use my scroll wheel to go up and down. That's on these because it's such a small amount. My scroll wheel, some people's doesn't. You know, when I click it, I can go up or down with the scroll wheel. If you have to hold it and drag it, I guess you would just move it just a smidge. But anyway, those are the numbers again. So here's another one. This doorway. It's virtually every photo. I keep saying here's another one. But it's a great example right there. You know, we just took that refrigerator and that doorway and straightened them right up. And once again, we're at +5 and +10. You know, you can always go further and see how it affects it. It's not going to hurt anything. I mean, you could probably get away with stopping at 10, but 5 is usually the trick. And I'm looking here. This looks like they're leaning just a little bit, so I'm going to bring them around just a touch. And again, you can get to a point where you bring it around enough, it makes sense to reduce the vertical. You know, I ended up taking and twisting this almost a full point and then reducing the vertical. But if I add that back up, it matches up with the grid line a lot better. But this all looks more even, and I almost like this better at 0 on this photo. But again, you start staring at something and you can overthink it, which is not the goal. And when I get to the end of the set and I start scrubbing back through these, if it's off, it'll stand out to the eye. Yeah, I think that looks good right there. So I end up at +10, +5, and I rotated it.